Two procurement nerds are back. We are recording on a Sunday. Incredible weather here in the Bay Area. I want to say it's like mid 70s and almost tanning weather. So
Yeah, it's 67 here in Oakland. So just nice blend of cool and just beautiful sunshine.
yeah. So today we're going to talk about something, Dr. Elouise. I know that you talked about this a lot last year when you still had your spider map, which is in reinvention mode, which I'm looking forward to seeing what you come up with this year. That's more AI centric and AI focused.
Yes.
So topic for today, and this was kind of brought up in our feeds and kind of brought to life again by a friend of the show, Jason Busch, who is the CEO and founder of Spin Matters, a friend of both of ours, and like to give him a shout out. We know he listens to our show regularly, but he did a post, and this is something that we've talked about previously and thought it made sense for us to kind of revisit as we're talking more and more about how AI is impacting procure tech. And a lot of the solutions are really going to have to change and innovate if they're going to stay relevant with all of the things that AI can already do. So Dr. Elouise, let's start with last year when you had the spider map. This was kind of a category that you eliminated and said, this is kind of dead, right?
Yeah, actually, the first time I said it publicly, that in a sort of public venue, was at the Zip Forward event in November of 2023. I'll never forget it because it was I was in New York the day before, and I got up early and flew from New York to San Francisco, and then went right to the city. And I remember changing in the Zip offices and getting ready, and because I was in New York for some other presentation, so it was one of those just like jet setting adventures. And so I fly, I land, I get to the city, I like change my clothes, and then did this fireside chat with Rajul from Zip, and we're chit chatting, and it was like a 30-minute fireside chat, and I don't know, somehow, oh, I think they had just announced earlier in the day something about their contract module or something related to contracts. And so the topic came up. I said to the audience, well, CLM is dead. Like I said, like, and this is in November of 23. And I was like it's done. It's toast. And all like you could just like the room was like I like there was a collective like sucking of the air in the room, and afterwards I just had a flood of people coming up to me saying, what do you mean, what do you mean we just put in whatever tool? And I started to kind of, because this was just the emergence of Gen AI, and it became like very clear early on that contracting and sort of CLM by extension was just in big trouble. And so it wasn't, and then so that sort of gave me the confidence to say, yeah, you know what, I have a feeling that this is because nobody was pushing back, and that's what I'm always looking for. Is if I'm provocative, I'll say it a few times to get the pushback. Anyway, so I didn't get any pushback, and then I thought I'd take the bold step of just removing it and making a public declaration around one of my spider map updates. And yeah, that got the ball rolling for sure. And yeah, we haven't looked back. And I thought Jason wrote a nice eulogy for CLM, and I responded by saying, almost never has so much money been spent for so little value. I mean, we could say that about ERP systems, but a CLM is just one of these just what do I want to say, stinkers of tools that we built it up as this big great thing, and it never delivered.
So let's start with some basics. What is a contract lifecycle management system? Like what was the original intent behind this whole category being created?
Yeah, I'll give it to you sort of my understanding of it, and I've done a lot of time, spent a lot of time exploring this. I wasn't there at the inception of
Yeah.
CLM, but I've seen it sort of from a procurement point of view for many years. It first off was it when I first saw it was sort of a contract repository, like a central place. And so you have to think about the late 90s, early 2000s when intranets were a thing and even extranets, if those, you remember those terms. But essentially is a place where you could just share your folder, share a folder, share, sorry, a shared folder of documents. And so, but it became clear early on, like, well, if you're going to post the documents there, it's not the documents that need it, it's the information inside of it. And AI and machine learning and even sort of these more sophisticated models didn't even exist. And even in like 2010 to 2016, 17, it's still machine learning wasn't quite there or wasn't sophisticated enough to do it, at least at scale. Like there were bits and pieces, but and so the fix was, okay, well, we're gonna, when you upload a document, you're gonna put the metadata in and you're gonna put all this stuff so then we can report on it, which was just like stupid and silly. And then so that was kind of one of the first, and then the second area, and I think mid 2000, 2005, somewhere between 2005 and 2010, you started to get the first inklings of authoring, where you would jointly author contracts in Word, and there were some plugins, extensions, and whatnot. This was long before Google Docs and now the Teams related sites where you could just jointly work on documents. So that kind of was like, okay, so now we have authoring. So my sort of impression, and I'd have to rely on somebody that was studying this market a little closer than I was, but essentially you had this like, oh, we can group this all together. We can group it as here's document storage, reporting on your contracts, authoring, and then pretty shortly thereafter became workflow, e-signature, and then intake, and largely that variations on that theme became what we know as the CLM market. What was always lacking was detailed analysis of or interrogation of the contracts, and that's where tools like Seal Software came along. They got acquired by DocuSign. Syrian Labs is still around. They came along and they started to look beyond just what's in the contract. And so, but what happened is that all the Coupas, Ariba's of the world, they sort of have their CLM module, which turned out to be trash, just absolute garbage. And then there's also, you have the iCertises and the Congas and all the others that were the upstarts that disrupted the legacy players in this space. And quite frankly, it became its own category software, but for what reason? Because it was never really solving the contract problem or the management problem.
Yeah, and when I think of CLM software, what pops into my mind is literally redlining.
Mm-hmm.
So the ability for legal to get involved with contracts, whether it's procurement or directly with the stakeholders, and kind of go back and forth with tracking of that. So for me, I think about it as one, the repository and having a central place to store the documents for reference. And then the second piece I think about is the redlining piece. But what's lacking is the actual strategy and incorporating it into a business process versus just kind of the random afterthought.
Yes. And that's, I mean, you you just summarized the biggest problem. I mean, that was it. And it's has like largely still been it, although we're now seeing solutions that kind of get past that.
So you in your spider mapping last year basically called out CLM's dead, kind of eliminated these providers from the category. And so what's going to happen? I mean, we have, I don't know how many, 20 plus different players in the CLM space. What are they going to do now with the rise of AI? I mean, I think that the real kicker here is, can AI really do 90 to 95% of what a CLM system does? Assuming we say the answer is yes, what happens?
Well, all those companies go away. I mean, they just this is the or they get just folded and they become small little parts of bigger software. And I think Jason had made this point of like, okay, well, you have your CRM solution or your legal tech solution or your whatever. You might have a little tiny bit of this, but or you look at what Zip and LevelPath are doing, where they have just sort of, let's call it lightweight CLM, because you don't really need much more than that, and you're off to the races. And that was the point I made some time ago. Is that why do I need that? Why do I need to spend 6 or 7 or even 8 figures on CLM? I don't. And so, and I think it's important to just look at it from a different angle. It's not uncommon for big enterprises for the sales team to have one CLM, the legal team to have a different CLM, and procurement to have yet a third CLM. When in reality, we need one CLM or one place where I should rephrase that. We need one place where the contracts sit, and then we can all jointly interrogate those, because in the 2025 and beyond, we're rapidly, we've entered I would argue we've entered a space where our our suppliers can frequently become our customers, and in some cases our competitors. So I think we have to be, I think contracts are a much more strategic opportunity than we really give them credit for. And I like the word you use, afterthought. It's just like, all right, well, we just have a CLM, just stick the contracts in there and call it good.
Yeah, instead of it being a part of the sourcing and negotiation and ongoing supplier management around KPIs and performance, I think that the whole CLM model makes it much more tactical. And I guess where my mind goes is our CLM solutions going to be absorbed into intake orchestration solutions, which are kind of the hot trending thing right now in 2025? Do we see either those companies folding into and/or orchestration platforms, incorporating it themselves? I think that is one highly likely scenario of where we're going to see this go in the next few months.
Well, I agree with you. I just think the true CLM players, I think their business just tapers off. I think the
Mhm.
exception is e-signature, because I do think that's a very tactical, practical solution that has a lot of merit. But I mean, if I'm an orchestration player, then why would I buy I don't know, iCertis or Conga or whoever else? Because quite frankly, I mean, it's just a repository, it's intake. Oftentimes, contracting has an intake component, and the orchestration tools do intake very well. And whatever else is like, the analysis. Well, all the newer orchestration platforms have this robust AI layer
Mhm.
that they're tapping into. So I think they're done. And if that wasn't enough pressure on the CLM providers, you also now have agents. And once you have an agentic framework in there, every user can just go use the agent to query the CLM. And I've heard that some CLM solutions are digging their heels in and charging you to store your documents in the CLM, and then charging you to access it with an agent, which just seems so stupid to me. It's beyond the pale.
So the other thing I think about, I think we're in a world where we're moving towards real-time compliance monitoring instead of doing it on a quarterly or annually basis. I feel like we're much more in like a live, hourly, daily type model. I see CLM being incorporated in the orchestration process And I see that involving or heavily bringing in this real-time compliance into the model, which I think is very beneficial.
Well, yes, and yeah, compliance and risk. So all of a sudden something happens, we need to see what that is and the impact is right now. And this is where the AI interrogation, if you will, of the contracts is very much a part of your risk management strategy. And too often, because we get into corporate, what's the word, corporate politics, where this group only does this amount of risk, and this that group only does this kind of risk, and that group does some other kind of thing. When in reality, risk doesn't care about your org structure. Bad actors, force majeure events don't care about your op model and who owns what. The reality is that that's not how the world works.
How do you see this impacting legal?
I mean, it already has. I mean, it's impacted legal for the last decade. So it's been quieter, at least for those of us in the ProcureTech space. We haven't seen it quite as up close, but if you actually track the legal tech market, it has changed a lot. That said, the legal profession is not one it's not one that is advanced on technology, and much of what they do is try to avoid evolving, transforming, and such. So it's not like they adopt it very quickly. But the thing about legal is that to train your basic machine learning all the way up to the more fancy LLMs, you need structured, or it helps to have highly structured data. And well, what's the one function with highly structured text data? It's legal, because it doesn't change that much. And so I mean, you sort of have this disruption of how we manage and handle and author and do compliance on contracts. And at the same time, you have this, like you can go out there and talk to, get advice, legal advice. Maybe you shouldn't, but you can get directional legal advice from any of the bigger AI platforms, which that puts a big threat on the legal profession. Not that I don't think it'll go away, but I think it has to recalibrate.
Yeah, and I think the legal profession, as will most or many or all of them in some sense, I think AI is going to have just a significant impact, especially with an older generation, like attorneys who are, 5, 10 years away from retirement. Are how many of them are actually going to embrace and pivot and modify their practice or their strategy to heavily incorporate AI? But I see, as CLM becomes more incorporated in the orchestration intake process, I see so much of the contracting piece being automated,
Yeah.
right? Just using AI, and however that back and forth works, pulling in data, doing redlining. I just think so much of the traditional contracting process is not going to be necessary much longer.
I agree. I mean, and uh, I mean, we're watching or I'm paying very close attention to how consulting is changing, and consulting is very on par with legal, lawyers, different in some core structural ways, but professional services, or high value professional services, this market is changing. And I don't necessarily, I mean, look, if I'm, I don't know, pick a Google or Meta or Salesforce, and or you're getting, maybe not Salesforce, but Microsoft. If antitrust, the government's coming after you for antitrust, you're going to hire the best and the brightest lawyers, because you need real legitimate experience in that. But to review contracts and to author contracts and all of that silly stuff, I mean, it's kind of obliterated the paralegal, and I think the lower tier attorneys, it's definitely going to happen. And in consulting, the same thing. The lower part, consulting's a pyramid. So as you sort of start, I think I've talked about this, like of the cohort of 10, only one will make partner, 20 years or 10 or 15 years later. And so, so like that bottom part of the pyramid, why do I need an analyst to do a bunch of data crunching on some Excel files or a database and to create a PowerPoint? I mean, I can have an agent do that today. And even if it's not perfect today, what will it be in a year from now? So the entire bottom part of the consulting pyramid is going to go away, which I just think and yeah, it's a fundamental shift for all of us.
So the other thing it makes me think about, and we've talked about this a few times on the show, is the whole idea of we went from all-inclusive end-to-end solutions back in the day in a major pivot, pendulum swing, to all about the niche solution and having a very, very pointed solution for specific categories or specific needs. I feel like we're moving back towards this integrated suite solution model. And I think that's another reason why this niche CLM solution model is going to quickly become irrelevant, because it's going to be integrated with these much larger, more robust solutions.
Yeah, so what I would say, it's more of a continuum versus a pendulum. Is the analogy I use, because we started with suites, that was a disaster. We the SaaS explosion, the SaaS procure tech explosion was a reaction, a very severe reaction to what was not working. And so we're going to continue on. And I do agree that what we're going to have is what I call AI platforms for procurement. And I think if you look at the level paths, the convergence, the zips of the world, they are on the precipice to enter in that what I call version 4.0, this AI procurement platforms, because they're doing exactly what you just said. You have all these you have these various capabilities, and what makes them different than the suites is that they're extensible, but they're also built on an AI platform. So if we want to incorporate a module like CLM, you're actually using, I should say they're using AI to rebuild the CLM versus just trying to go duplicate something in the back end of the market.
Mm-hmm. So I guess it would be really interesting. We normally don't have guests on the show, but it would be interesting to have a couple CLM companies and pitch and come on and pitch their case, because I don't even know how they're going to be relevant by the end of this year.
I agree. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure any of them will talk to me, but it might be worth it. Yeah. And you can see it. Some of them are pivoting already and talking about other things. And I'll give a shout out to Irwin. He's a founder of a company called Flip Through. And as near, I mean, he's very early on, I think a couple of people, and he's got a whole Gen AI solution built around contracts, kind of various aspects. I'm oversimplifying, but it's so what I saw was just really fascinating, and it's exactly as I would imagine, as I'm describing it over the last 20 minutes. What I've been describing, like he just went and built, and then he's adding RFP to it, like a RFP capabilities. And it's just like, when I see that, it just blows my mind, because it's just like, oh yeah, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. And
the turnaround time, it's not like years, it's like weeks.
Right, because I have a special thing, a private workshop I'm doing, and I invited him to it in June. And it's what, 6 weeks away. Let's call it 6 weeks away. And he was sort of thinking out loud about talking about all the features he's gonna add, like major things that he's gonna add in 6 weeks, because 6 weeks is forever in AI development time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. Super, super interesting. And I think CLM is not alone, right? We're going to see this across many of the other niche categories as well, where AI is coming in and able to do so much and be having so much incorporated into the orchestration intake platforms.
Yeah, and I also would make another, highlight another point Jason made is you might also get vertical solutions, because this is something else that I've sort of been noodling on, is this idea like Valera does chemicals. And I think having a vertical top to bottom includes contracting, includes pricing, benchmarks, sourcing, etc. So suppliers, like I'll buy that. Like that I get. Like, because then it's very niche, and we've seen some with some other categories. Like I like that. I love that. And eventually, when we get enough of them, we might have some sort of marketplace where you go to get the best of each of those. But I do want to flag that the vertical solution is something that we have not really talked about for the last decade, and I think quietly we've Pinpools is another one, and FineTune, and some of the, and then of course Green Cabbage and some of these other folks. I do think there are, I as those tools continue to develop and do whatever they do, I will buy that those are really compelling, or those are compelling.
And I will also say that, given that I have manufacturing direct experience in my previous role, I do think you're going to see some more industry specific solutions specifically around manufacturing, because there's so much going on in the manufacturing space with the introduction of robotics, that I could see some very niche, very direct specific solutions start to come into the market. And I think that's a space we should watch as well.
Yeah, I totally agree. And as we talked, I think like a couple months ago, direct still is relatively underserved. And again, I think we're just shouting out everybody today, but Spencer from LightSource, I think one of the things, his major valuation was indicative of what you were just saying.
A $33 million Series A round is,
crazy,
unheard of, especially in 2025.
Yeah, and congratulations. But it also tells you how underserved that market is, and it's only going to become more difficult.
Yep. All righty. Is that the pod for the week?
I think it is. And we've got an exciting one for next week. So stay tuned, because I'm really excited for next week.
Yeah, we'll see you next Wednesday.